So, powerful messaging. A message is not delivered until it is understood. So this is really a key point, is that so much of our messaging is not broken through a lot of the barriers. So we need to ask ourselves why this is the case. Today is a beta test, so there could be a few graphical errors, but that's fine. We're much concerned with the substance. And we're very grateful to a lot of the experts we've been able to consult with. We spoke to a lot of sort of world-leading behavioral scientists, lots of psychologists, so we're very confident that this is going to be very useful. So let's start with a magic trick. Okay, everyone, pick a card. Okay, hold that card in mind, and I am going to flip the card on its back. Okay, if you've seen this trick, don't share it yet, but I'm pretty sure I've guessed, or I've removed your card, haven't I? Okay, and I'll show you at the end how that works. So today's agenda is, at the end, we're going to have a bonus tip. And this really is basically one of the easiest ways to really, like all of us have these annoying people that come onto our posts. Okay, this bonus tip will allow you to really get those people to start thinking and go silence for a while. It works with most people. We've been using it for a while now. It's very, very powerful. Just really, and it's not coercive in any way. It's just a very powerful thing to do. We're going to introduce some template examples. Before that, we're going to introduce the template. Before that, we're going to look at how we're influenced. So you'll see that there's this building to the end. In order to see how we're influenced, we need to understand what fuels our behavior. And in order to understand what fuels our behavior, we need to understand what drives us. So when we build this picture bit by bit, and we're going to build it bit by bit, at the end of today, we're going to have a pretty good idea of how we've been influenced, what drives us, and then we're going to have really good information for when we start thinking about our messaging on what's going to resonate and what's going to work and reach people. So what drives us? So essentially, if we have our person here, what drives all behavior from, all species and cells is that we move away from pain and we move towards pleasure. This is the basic hard wiring. It can be that, we've represented fire as being a pain there, but that would be if we touched it, and food as being pleasurable. But these could be the other way around. So for some people, bread would be painful, and yet a fireplace would be pleasurable. So really, there's only two fears that we're inherently born with, and that's the fear of loud noises and the fear of dropping. But every other thing is really we're conditioned to learn. So really what fuel drives us to move from one thing to another. And effectively, it's the emotions. It's the emotions that drive us from pain to pleasure. This is such an important point. It's not logic that drives us. The fuel is emotion. Logic allows us to calculate things and work out what things would be pain and pleasure, but it's actually the emotion that drives us. So moving away from something that hurts is predominantly fear, and moving towards something that we like is predominantly happiness, and then there's a whole scale of other emotions coming predominantly under those two aspects. So an example of emotion over logic, because a lot of people say, oh, no, I'm very logical, and you'll see so many neuroscientists who explain that that's not the case. In fact, we all, we can have the experience of being logical, but at its base level, emotions will drive everything. They did a study, and we mentioned this a few weeks ago, and students were asked to put their hand in freezing water for 60 seconds as the first part of the study. The second part of the study was to put their hands in freezing water for 60 seconds plus 30 seconds, just a little bit less cold. Okay, so if we look at this now, logically, we know which one's worse. The students were given the opportunity to repeat one of these studies again. And what do you think happened? 80% of them preferred to repeat the second one, B. Okay, that makes no logical sense. Looking from here, having an aerial view, we can understand that that's not logical. But when you're in it and you don't have the experience of hindsight, 80% of people chose B. Now, we're generally seeing 80% of people do a lot of things. And I think it's because people are emotionally driven and missing this critical aspect. Really, critical thinking allows us to look at this and go, oh, that really doesn't make any sense. But when you're in it and emotional, you can actually make decisions. And I know in myself that many a time I will come home from shopping and realize that I've been influenced by my emotions over my logic. So in order to understand this at a slightly deeper level, we first have to look at what the conscious and unconscious minds of us are, because this will really give us a lot of answers about what's driving our behavior. So the conscious mind, which we all have this feeling that we're always conscious and rational, and I've just studied this for so long, I know that I'm not, is that the conscious mind we're going to represent as the rider, and the unconscious mind we're going to represent as a horse. This metaphor is going to explain a lot to us. The rational mind, the conscious mind, thoughts, emotions, rationality, questions, the ability to cognitive function, what we're aware of. So all of these things in our awareness is our conscious mind, what we're aware of at any one point in time. The unconscious mind is a reservoir of memories, thoughts, emotions, and urges. Okay, so it's really the unconscious mind is driving a lot of our primal needs, our wants, and our urges. The conscious mind is in constant communication with the unconscious mind. The people that have a lot more peace in their life tend to have much of a smoother communication between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And this is what the Zen masters are looking to achieve. They're looking to have this real, ability to communicate with their unconscious mind. So when we think about what we move away from, because we know that we move away from pain and towards pleasure, let's have a look at an example. This is very interesting because this starts to explain to us that some of our primal fears, even though we're conscious of them, we can't change them until we start to communicate with the horse. So we have a spider phobia or fear of flying. So what happens is that the horse will move away from these. Our unconscious mind, via fear or any other emotion, moves us away from these. If you ask a person in the UK who's scared of spiders, whether there's any dangerous spiders in the UK that they should be scared of, they will consciously tell you no. But that doesn't stop them being scared. That makes sense. There's a really important distinction there, that the conscious awareness, and this is why a lot of the sort of speaking to people can have a, can be very useful for opening up, but it won't often get to the crux of the problem. And I spent many years actually curing phobias for people. So we understand literally how it can be done, and it can be done very effectively, but it's not done via talking to the person's conscious mind. It's actually, you have to communicate with the person's unconscious mind. So this is an example of away from. An example of moving towards would be chocolate. So I'm sure most of us on here at the moment, we have cravings for chocolate or anything else that's pleasurable. We would move towards it. Emotions would drive us forward. What you'll find is with a population that generally about, and this is just a general context assumption that we've found out from the studies, it's about 70% of people generally move away from things and 30% of people move towards. But we're doing them always in sort of combination, but people have a tendency to be one more than the other. So this is a towards. So then if we start to look at, okay, so that's how I naturally function. How does advertising start to manipulate this understanding in order to manipulate us? And of course, advertising really is a classic example of this. And the information from marketing and behavioral sciences has gone from marketing and is now moved into governments and institutions. And that's why we're seeing so much dysfunction in our present day world. So an example of moving away from, so conscious mind, the unconscious mind would be the advertising. I mean, you see some of these are very visceral, very emotional, not a great deal of logic. But although the logic and the fact is there, and that is just, I mean, that's such a visceral picture, that one of a moldy burger. So emotions, these advertising, these messages are actually to get someone to move away from something. And that's why when we start to think about the messaging that we wish to convey, we're thinking, do I want someone to move away from something or towards something? So it's really to be very clear on what that is. And of course, when we look at the advertising moving towards, which is an awful lot of, and some of it's pretty crass, as you're about to see, is that this is a classic one. I found this quite funny, the old Spice advert. And then, of course, you know, many things sell, but this is very distasteful in my perspective. But look at the emotions that they're trying to drive. They're trying to drive people towards these products. So what they essentially do is that when I was training with one of my mentors many years ago, he said advertising really boils down to one thing: elicit emotion, attach that emotion to product. That's it. So when we're thinking about influencing people, and there is a way to ethically influence people, it's going to be emotions that drive people. It's not going to be logic. And the amount of academics who have done some incredible flyers, which just don't work, is because when you're very logical, you think that everyone else is going to be logical, and that's not the case. Predominantly people are emotional. So this starts to explain why so much of the government messaging is totally devoid of facts, because it doesn't need to be. They've managed to influence everyone via emotional messaging. So I'm just going to pause there for a moment. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to chat it in, type it in the chat. If anything up to now was not clear or needs clarity. So hopefully it should be step-by-step understanding that primarily we're driven by pain and pleasure, moving away from pain, moving towards pleasure. And if those things get switched, people will move towards pain because the horse thinks it's pleasure. That makes sense? So a lot of the conditioning from a childhood is associated to some of the behaviors that we do that are not healthy for us as being pleasurable. That makes sense? This explains it. Consciously, it annoys us because we think that we should just change, but it's emotions that drive us. So how are we being influenced right now? And for the last 2 years, I mean, the manipulation has been amplified significantly. So here's the pain, the thing to move away from. You know, then this is a virus or government overreach, depends whatever it is, but generally a lot of us are moving away from something. Yes, and in fact, one of the reasons that fear has been pushed so much is because it takes the rational mind down, and then you're literally, the horse is rolling the show, and the horse is going to move away from fear. So that's why fear was literally at the forefront of the strategy of many of the institutions and governments. So if we look at this, we find ourselves in that in any moment, we've usually got 2 or 3 decisions, and these choices will come up continuously. Now, what happens is that if an institution wants us to comply with something, then they will use a pathway that's driven predominantly by emotions. Okay, there will be some logic in it, predominantly by emotions. By the same token, the pathway that they do not want us to take will also have an emotions, but driving us away from that path. And they also have what's known as sludge. Sludge is basically just obstacles. So they will make it, as you'll notice in the current day, it's almost impossible in some countries now to move around unless you've complied with what the government has instructed. This is sludge, making it so difficult that someone just goes, you know what, I'm going to take the path of least resistance. This is why this is so important, because when you look, for instance, if you go onto a website and buy something, you notice how easy it is to sign up for something, a subscription, but how difficult it is to cancel. That's designed on purpose. That's to make the path that they wish you to take easy and the path which they wish you not to take hard. This is why so many of terms and conditions are in fine print. In fact, in today's world, informed consent is not only hidden, not only in like small print, but often hidden from us. So what you'll find is that so many of these pathways, in that we're being, and the nudge unit is effectively that the authority will say to the nudge unit, this is the pathway we want the public to take, please nudge them that way. Now, if you look at this model that you're looking at now, literally took 6 to 9 months to do, and it looks really simple now, but we went through so many iterations in getting it this simple. And that through this, I think we can actually pretty much explain every nudge and also all the cognitive biases. So you have all the elements, which is, you know, the choice architecture, they really, you know, condition us which pathway to take. And many people, you'll notice, have taken this pathway, even though they didn't want to, just because this pathway was very difficult. Just leave me alone. Even Jordan Peterson took two doses of something just to let them leave him alone. And they soon realized that wasn't a strategy that was going to work. And he's really become very vocal. Now, what you find is that these pathways don't have to create division, but they have. And they've created divisions on purpose, because what they've done is they've labeled these pathways. And these pathways, this is structure, and we're looking at a specific example soon. But then what you find is that you then get this gap, this polarity. When they talk about, society being polarized at the moment, it's because these pathways go in very different directions. So if we look at an example, which is wear a mask. So obviously people are moving away from the virus, but not always. So a lot of people that wear in a mask is not because it makes them feel safe or any of those emotions. In fact, wearing a mask has many different causes. One of the causes will be fear, and you'll know that because if you get too close to that person, they get very scared. One of the emotions will just be conformity, just to not stand out. That makes sense? So you'll have a whole series of emotions that will take someone down here. But here's the problem. A lot of people not wearing a mask are actually experiencing emotions themselves. Now, this is a very key point. It's been very difficult to get people to let go of this angle of masks, because masks are very symbolic. But until we let go of these emotions, and that's what we do on a Tuesday night, it's going to be very hard to reach someone that's on this other side, because people will detect the anger, the tonality, all these things, and it will switch them off faster than anything you can say. So it's very good to come to a point, because historically, if you were to ask a child what they wanted to do for a living, they would say the same as their parents or the opposite. But that's not true freedom, is it? Because you're still bound by that point as an anchor point. So it's really good if we can let go of all these emotions, because then we're not being coerced or we're not controlled. That makes sense? So it's, in fact, both of these pathways tend to be controlled. And of course, this is the perfect way to create divide and conquer, which is, as we mentioned with Brexit, they managed to do it 50-50, and now a lot more. And obviously, this is where it's important. It's not going to be consciously easy to switch off these emotions. Okay, so don't feel bad in any way that it's difficult. This is why we run the Tuesday night session, which is a free session, to do an exercise to allow these emotions to subside. Okay, so consciously, a lot of the time you can't decide on these things. And that's why we work with the unconscious mind with various exercises. But hopefully now through this model, you'll start to see that you can pretty much take any way that they're influencing us, and they're literally managing our decisions. So if you were to think about brainstorming, the reasons that people wear a mask, you'll see there'll be a whole bunch of different reasons. So to tell someone logically why they shouldn't wear a mask is not going to make any difference if they're not wearing a mask because of logic. That makes sense? If they're wearing a mask to conform, you're going to be pushing against their fear of pushing against authority. And it's only when we begin to see below the surface of what's driving behavior that we can actually start to influence it in a positive way. Pushing against it does not work. I think hopefully we've all, well, the ones that it would work against would have already worked, in my opinion. There will still be some people. So if we look at an example nudge, the thing is, once you see this, you can't unsee it. You're going to see this everywhere in your environment. So I need a coffee. So this gentleman goes to a coffee shop. Okay. Now, this was a very popular coffee company. They were all over the world. They were the ones that did this. So they had three sizes. They had the small, the medium, and the large, evenly distributed in price, 3, 4, and 5. Once they understood choice architecture, what they did was they realized that people, if there's no price difference, in fact, if they all appear to be the same value, most people will choose the medium. Okay, that's just the middle of the road thing that is generally a safe choice. What they did was they made the medium small, and they bought in an extra large and they removed the small. And then what happened was that people chose the medium. So they went from selling £4 coffee to £5 coffee, all by changing your choices, okay? They also do this with popcorn and many other things. So with the popcorn, what they do is, or in fact, this manipulation is manipulating your choices. What they also do is if they made the medium £5.50, most people then choose the large because the large now looks to be the most fat. Does that make sense? You see how just subtle changes to our environment. So there's two ways that we can be influenced. One of them is by changing the environment. And if you think about a magician, that's what they're very good at. They're very good at misdirection and environment. So one thing is manipulating the environment. The second thing is manipulating our perception. Okay, and that's a lot more insidious because in fact, they're manipulating how we think. Okay, to take away the small and put in the extra large. That's a bit of a white lie. You know, it's still not ethical. But the other one, manipulating how we think, is not a white lie. So let's have a look at an example of a nudge and the influence factors. And influence factors are just, there's many of them. So one of them is the authority factor, where people tend to trust authority. So there's just many different influence factors. And on other calls, we've gone through all of these, so we won't do now. But in the next slide, we're going to take a text message that's been sent to a lot of people. We're going to have a look how many influence factors did they fit into one text. Now this slide was from Patrick Fagan, who's a behavioral scientist, and he's really doing a lot of good work to expose a lot of the manipulation. What you'll notice, if we look left to right, is that they've literally used very, very specific wording to elicit things in us that will influence us. That makes sense? So you have reached the top, presupposes that we've been waiting. Okay, so we've now committed to it. The top plays the ego. Oh, I'm now top of the tree. Q, social proof. It means that everyone's doing it. Free, reciprocity. Oh, someone's giving me something free. Scarcity, priority. So there's not many of them. Now you notice the scarcity. Did you notice every product throughout the pandemic was in major short supply initially? I mean, wow, what a coincidence. Everything, we've only got so many of this. This is one of the biggest ways to influence us. If we think there's only a few left, then we will rush. And then obviously the authority by using the NHS or the branding. So you can see this one slide, this one message is leveraging so many of the ways that we're influenced. So just going to pause there. So up to now, is everything still pretty much understandable and clear? Is there anything that's very hazy that anyone would like to type in the chat? And obviously I'll just give you a minute to absorb that because there's a lot of information we're absorbing. Excellent. And obviously on those references to the emotions we feel, once we get into that rational part of the mind, we realize we don't want to feel those emotions. But and this is why I say to people, you know, don't feel bad about it, because you can't decide what you feel. What you feel is what you feel. Okay, and just pushing it down tends to have not a very powerful, you know, a very useful effect. So now we know what drives us. Okay, we know that it's really our emotions are being coerced. We know that, you know, what we want to move towards and move from. So now let's look at a template for how we can start to use this in an ethical way. That's a very key point. We're not going to, you know, do a counter narrative per se. And of course, what are the ethical uses of messaging? So for me, it's to inform people. So what's happened, as you know from the influences, if people don't have information available, they usually do not look for it. So what they've done in the informed consent is they've hid it, okay? And nearly all the documents I've witnessed have hid it in a very intentional and coercive way. So if we're messaging people just to inform them, that's an ethical use because we're creating extra pathways for them. And of course, the point is you cannot not influence, okay? We're always influencing each other. You know, people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King have influenced millions and millions of people in a very positive way. What we have is really the intention is key. Okay, and it's really hitting the target. So another way to ethical influence people is to create choice. Okay, so we show them a choice that they didn't previously have. Okay, and we show, and this is particularly when you look at the early treatments, ivermectin, HCQ, they were hidden on purpose because it created a tunnel, a sales funnel, as it's known, to move people from problem to solution. And obviously, when you start to see this, you're going to go through a range of emotions today, which are going to be, you know, starting at anger. But in fact, by the end of it, you'll feel very empowered, because you'll start to realize how we've been manipulated, how we can protect ourselves, and then how we can start helping others. And it's really key that when we're helping others, we are doing it from a place of creating the conditions where if they can take it or leave it. Okay, it's not for us to force anyone to do anything. And when we have this as an energy we're coming from that's very caring, people tend to respond a lot better. And I think this is one of the biggest problems that a lot of people are, obstacles a lot of people are facing. Another use of messaging, which I predominantly use a lot of my time doing, is exposing the manipulation and censorship. Okay, because the censorship is so nefarious because it takes away choice for people. Okay, the manipulation is literally nudging people down a pathway that somebody wants someone to take that's not in their interest in many of the cases. So Ken, what is free will? If we're being censored, then we have less free will. So understanding this information, learning it, getting good with it, will actually empower us to have more free will. This is why it's very exciting to really, you know, it's very disturbing initially, but then what I realized is that what the behavioral insights teams have done is they've made some startling discoveries over behavior, over how we make decisions. But rather than this be given to the people, as so often is the case for startling discoveries, it's been used to coerce the people or to, you know, take away their wealth. And of course, remember, emotions choose the path. Okay, so this is very key, because when we're messaging, if we come from a very good place, that's going to affect everything after that. So yeah, just to really bear that in mind. So I think it really is possible to be very ethical in messaging. I know it's possible. It's what I train to do. And this is why telling stories and using metaphor and asking questions is very, very powerful, because you're enabling people to absorb information. And obviously this is why the stories have to be truthful, or at least if they're fables, to have a good moral. And the questions, you're enabled to show them where they're not thinking about something, or to bring something into awareness or highlight something. Okay, so now, and this I've just put on the website. I believe it's accessible, and I can pop the file in the chat, but this essentially is the message template. So, and didn't have enough time to make it very snazzy, but if we talk it through, and I would, at this point, I would get a pen and paper. And in fact, what we can do, so grab a pen and paper, or even if you want to do it in your head, and then imagine there's a message that you want to impart. There's something you wish to say. Okay, so just choose a topic. So in this first box over here, what is it I want to say? Okay, this is very important, because so much of our messaging, we don't think what we want to say. We often react to what someone others said, and we often react with emotions. Yeah, so if we allow ourselves to get very calm, and then we think, actually, what is it I want to say? And when I do this, I often ask, what is the effect? You know, what effect do I want? What outcome or picture do I want to portray? So if someone's been, you know, coming from a place of false assumptions, a lot of the time I will ask them a question to ask them to define what they mean. Does that make sense? So I know very clearly what I'm doing when I'm doing that. I'm not manipulating them. I'm bringing something into awareness. Yeah, and that, with those sorts of questions, you can be very, very, you have a lot of effect. Then, of course, a very key question when you're messaging, if you don't have an interactive message, is who are the audience? Okay, so often I see a messaging that is not taking into consideration the audience. If the audience is people in our echo chamber, the message is going to be very different than if it's people that are outside of our groups. Does that make sense? The messaging is going to be very different. You can use different words, You can use different methods, all these things, but you have to be very audience focused. And I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that I see that very intelligent people make, is that they think, my father used to do this actually, when he would literally, for my birthday, he'd buy me something he wanted to buy me. He wouldn't think about what I want. Okay, and it was very sweet because it was like, you would see someone's personal influence over that. But when it comes to messaging, it's very key. What is the person? What is the audience? What are they going to respond to? Okay, so that's the purpose. And it's very key because I think when we think about people like David Allen, who's a consultant on productivity, so often we start with ideas and we will get mind blocks because ideas is the third step. The first step is, what is the purpose? Why am I doing this? The second step is the vision. What do I want to see? And once you get those two things answered, all the ideas will flow, and they will flow quite naturally. That's the flow state. That makes sense? Most of us start at the wrong step. So the first thing we have to do when we know what our message is we have to capture attention. Okay? If we don't capture attention, it does not matter what we say. You'll notice this is literally around the internet, everywhere is clickbaiting, isn't it? Everything is about capturing someone's attention. Whilst I don't like clickbaiting, the method, if you don't capture someone's attention, they are not going to read what you have or listen to what you have to say. So it's a very important point, and it can be done ethically. Obviously, the rebels are fantastic. The signs on the things, that captures attention, doesn't it? So they've done that, okay? Obviously, you start to think about the graphics that are used, the visuals, all these things, but we're not going to go into that today because today is really the intro, high level. So then obviously, it's got to be emotional. It's got to have an emotional component, yeah, because every decision has an emotional component. There's numerous TED Talks that are fantastic to explain this, but if the emotion is missing, people actually don't, or literally can't make a decision. So there's a number of test cases where someone's had a brain injury that's, injured the emotional part of the brain. The person stayed just as intelligent, but they lost the ability to make decisions and their whole life fell apart. But they was able to score just as much on exams. And one example was one of the neuroscientists was talking to this guy and he couldn't find anything wrong with him. But then when he asked him, when do you want to book in to come back? The guy couldn't answer. He literally couldn't decide which day was better. That makes sense. So the emotions are the check. When it comes to capturing attention, if it's surprising, that's tends to be very useful. It tends to, because what we're doing is, if something is what we know, it doesn't stand out. When something is different or surprising, it stands out. That makes sense. So that's why it captures engagement and attention. Okay. And of course, if you write down a message and then you just jot down a word or two in those, so you get an example. We're going to look at a few examples in a minute. It becomes very useful. So then the second stage is you've got to ignite engagement. Okay. And I've been doing some tests when I tweet, and I tweet same thing in two different versions, and one of them gets retweeted and liked and the other one just passes people by. The message was the same, okay, but it didn't get people's curiosity up. Okay. And there is a natural thing with some people that are very good on Twitter, just have a natural way of making something very interesting. Okay, there's a fluency that's very important. Have you noticed how so much of the government things rhyme? How so much of it has a certain rhythm and a fluency to it? That's not accidental. So many of the challenge in the narrative messaging is very unfluent, so it becomes very difficult for the brain to process. And then, of course, down here, when we ignite engagement, we've got narratives and factors. So narratives, what we mean is really stories and metaphors, okay? And then within the factors is what are the things that are going to prick people's attention and really ignite that. Okay, now I'm well aware this is very sort of text heavy, this slide, but we didn't get enough time to really do an in-depth thing. So then when we look at message delivery, now this is, I think, one of the most important things, and one of the biggest errors that people make is that we need to understand what it is we need to navigate. I've seen some literally, geniuses making this error. where they will, the 3 words that will switch someone off quicker than any other words are "you are wrong." Okay, I would suggest never using them, because the ego is very fragile. To the brain can't tell the difference between a threat to us physically and a threat to our ego. It's the same part of the brain. It doesn't know the difference, which is why people react so badly to having their ego challenged. If you do want to, if there is someone being an absolute arse, then feel free to poke the ego. But I think we should use these in a very positive way. Trigger words. This is very key. In our messaging, avoid, I pretty much replace trigger words with a different word. Okay? Trigger words will just switch people off. And we know what a lot of those trigger words are, sheep, hoax, all these things are really just, the problem is, and the reason I think a lot of us are challenged in this, in that so many people that we talk to, they like the messaging, okay, because it resonates with them, but it won't resonate with the people we're trying to reach. So in fact, we end up in these echo chambers. That makes sense. And that's why, and then these echo chambers really just become polarized and further away from each other. And then CD, which we won't go into today, but we covered extensively last week and will be uploaded to the website, is cognitive dissonance. Okay. Be very careful about presenting facts. If you present a fact that contradicts the fact that the person believes, it will be rejected nearly every time, unless the person sees you as an authority. Okay, the authority will supersede this cognitive dissonance, and we looked in the structure of that last week. But be very careful with the facts. So I generally don't give people conclusions. I give them breadcrumbs that lead them to a conclusion. So you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make the horse drink. So much of our messaging, I just wonder whether it would be better. And of course, if you've got lots of authority, then it's fine, because, if you're a doctor that's talking to your patients, then they really will listen to you. And the same with the media. If you suddenly own a mainstream media, you can also do this. But this will explain why the elites bought all the mainstream media. So the second part is go deep and make it digestible. And we won't go into this today, but it's really to think about how will people absorb the information. And of course, the last one is will it resonate? So much of our messaging really will resonate on a level that we can't describe. And it's really a vibration within us. So be positive if it's possible, but most certainly be caring. Because and there is an element of being, called to be kind or tough love, and that will come into it, but you've got to be, it's got to be a case-by-case basis. Now, all the studies show that if we dislike someone, they will not listen to us. Well, we won't listen to them. And if we're not listening to them, they won't listen to us. So this is very key that we've got to get over these things. Oh, so examples of breadcrumbs. Is really what are the things that lead to a conclusion. So let's say that someone says, lockdown's work. Then you would start to ask them the questions about the breadcrumbs. I usually start, is it important to have accurate data? Okay, once people commit to then analyzing it, then I'll go step by step. But what I won't say is lockdowns cause problems. That makes sense, because you're giving the conclusion. If they believe they don't, then you're just going to clash. So with those breadcrumbs is to start looking at some of the elements that make up that conclusion. And then what you essentially, the perfect scenario is where you provide someone with all the information where they make the conclusion. Now, we do go into this onto other things. I can't go into it too today because it does take a long while to really understand this. But the easiest way I can say that if you give someone the punchline of a joke without telling them the body of a joke, they won't understand it. That makes sense? Okay, so the last thing, and of course, envisioning how we would use this template is to use it and start to, just start to fill each box out. So if you're going to do a message, just sit down and, like anything, when you got in the car to learn to drive, it was all you had to think about it. I don't have to think about these now because it's just become a natural behavior. Okay. And that's what happens. You just practice and practice and it becomes second nature. So in terms of the call to action, be very clear. What action do I want to inspire? Okay. What do I want to happen here? And you'll notice that this is the thing that the people pushing, the authorities know very clearly what they want. Or alternatively, and there will be instances where you won't fill every box in. So on the end thing, you might want to inspire action, or you just might want to allow someone to be more knowledgeable, okay? But you want to know which of those it is. And then the third one, and probably a really important one, is what was the response? Because so much of the knowledge that works on this project has come from just asking that question. Just keep trying. You know, if you've got 50 doors and behind one of those doors is a prize, you're only going to find the prize by trying the doors. You know, if you've got no prior information, you're not going to know which one works. That makes sense. So there's a lot of these feedback loops, and having the template is going to allow you to turbo up to a state where you're going to know a lot of things that don't work, and then you're going to learn very quickly what styles do you use that will work. Okay, so I'm just going to stop there for a moment, pause for any questions, because now I'm going to look after this at a couple of examples of messaging that looks good and messaging, and it's the content's irrelevant. I'm not concerned whether it's true or not. I'm concerned whether the messaging is powerful. So any Q&A on so far? Okay, brilliant. And obviously, I'm very aware that there's only so much we can take in one day. So let's be very gentle. So here's a messaging, okay? Now, very emotional, very succinct, hardly any words, very clear. The call to action is very clear, isn't it? Okay. You've got the dog in the picture, animals people respond to. You've got the stereotypical narrative that's been pushed at the moment, all these things. So it's very resonant to a lot of people's position at the moment. Okay. And it's also trying to come across as caring, isn't it? Okay. Then we look at a really fantastic flyer academically, but where's the emotion? Where's the engagement? Where's the capturing? It's all words. So my general feeling now, and of course you have to really take this with a little bit of salt and be very specific to your situation. I generally don't think it's possible to get more than one, maybe two messages out in any one thing. Okay. What happens is a lot of people try to cram everything into one flyer. And what ends up happening is it's not read. Okay. How easy was it to read this? Okay. You got that message very, very quickly, didn't you? What's the message in here? Okay. It doesn't even tell you at the top. It's telling you there is a message, but it's not telling you what that message is. That means it's not clear, even though everything in this flyer is technically brilliant, in my opinion. So then we look at another one. Okay, look at this. Yeah, very, very simple message. That literally sort of thing, very much. When I look at this, even though I don't agree with it, I still feel the emotion. Yeah, not always the emotion they want me to feel, but you see how simple but very powerful it is. Obviously, we don't have millions of dollars and billions of dollars budget on advertising, so we've got to find a middle ground where we can get a message across and find a way of doing it. Another, again, here's an academically brilliant thing, but now what we know about emotions, and we can't process too much at one time, like it's too much, isn't it? For us, what's funny about these, or not funny, but what's interesting about these is that anyone that agrees with the message in here will actually find this brilliant. But they're not the people we need to reach. And that's the problem with so much of our messaging, is we're not crossing the glass ceiling, the glass wall between us and the people that think differently. And in fact, because most of the facts in here will contradict what they believe, it actually will just be rejected. Okay. I'm not saying that this doesn't work, because there will be people that will be very critically minded, go, okay, I need to read that. But we've probably already reached those. That makes sense. So we're looking now to reach the people that are easily coerced by emotions and doing it in an ethical way. So hopefully we start to get and of course, this is a taste. This is the start of this. This is the intro to this, to start to really think about what makes a good message. Okay. And there's so many areas to practice this. And this is one of the things that I take a specific part of the day to always practice this and refine it and refine it and refine it. And of course, so we'll get some examples. So here's one that I tweeted, probably two more words than I wanted, but this got, you know, I've only just created my Twitter profile. So I've only got a couple hundred people following me at the moment, but almost half of those liked this one. Okay. Very curious. Look at the question I asked. So the first part was startling. BIT have made a startling discoveries about human behavior and how we make this. Has this been? So look at the curiosity, the engagement. Okay, and a lot of people actually answered this. Okay, and you look at this next one that I did, okay, which is actually a really important message, but it didn't resonate with anyone. Literally one retweet and one like. Okay, the understanding those two things are absolutely essential to really busting the whole narrative. But they're not engaging, are they? What are they? What do they do? Okay, there's a little bit of engagement in the second part. So can we see the differences between those two things just on a high structural level? So yeah, so just let that process for a moment, because what I'm going to do next is show you that bonus tip about how to really keep a lot of the people that object quiet. And then I'm going to answer that magic question that we had at the start for those of you that haven't seen it before. Okay. Oh, so in terms of how they're different, so the first one, you know, some words in there like start then and whatever, but it's curious. So I've asked a question that people are like, oh, so it's engaged them. Okay. Whereas the second one is just, oh yeah, well, Twitter is, you know, definitely a breeding ground for nonsense, but it's really just to show an example of sending out messages. That's all it is. And you know, social media have certain engagement, but what I do is I go to all the places where people tweet what I consider to be false assumptions, and I will ask them a question a lot of the time. Okay. And, you know, how often that gets through, I don't know, because, you know, it's very hard to judge that. But I do know the question, if they read it, would actually cause them some discomfort in terms of challenging them. Okay, so the tip around when people come and literally, so let's say you've made a Facebook or a tweet, and then you get people just coming back, usually with a lot of abuse. Or, you know, counting what you say. And in fact, what you want to do, and I'm just going to read from the study in a minute, but essentially, in fact, I'll read the study first. So, in political extremism, in one study by Phil Fernbach and colleagues, experimenters asked subjects what political causes were close to their hearts, and then asked them to give reasons why they support them. Afterwards, the experimenters offered to donate money on the subject's behalf to an advocacy group for these particular causes. And more often than not, the subjects agreed. Okay, so they basically asked them why they believe something, and then it further embedded their belief in that subject, which is why I hardly ever use the why question to anyone that believes different to me. If they're within my group, the why question becomes very useful. In a second trial, and this, I literally think this is one of the key points to actually breaking down a lot of the, in fact, I do actually believe you can break someone out of a trance with this question. In a second trial, experimenters asked subjects what political causes were close to their hearts, and then asked them to simply explain the causes in detail. So they didn't ask them why. They in effect asked them, what do you mean, or what's the causes for you to believe that? Very subtly different, okay? In this trial, however, people largely declined to the experimenter's offers to donate. After explaining the causes, the subjects often realized they didn't actually know as much as they thought they knew. And rather than dig deeper into the issues, they wanted to dig deeper into the issues before giving them money. Does that make sense? So effectively, what that does, and that's an article that Max was really great to post. I'm going to post it in the chat. But it's very, very important because there's such a subtle distinction. So how have I used that information? When people come onto, and they don't come onto my posts anymore, but generally I've asked members of the group to tag me if someone comes in and starts being a bit obnoxious. All I do is ask them, what they mean by the statement they make. Okay. And usually they come back once, but no more. I've yet to have someone stay engaged. They just disappear nearly every time. Okay. Now, thinking about how we wish to use this, if that, because we want to maintain engagement, obviously, but that question will undoubtedly create cognitive dissonance. And what I've noticed in the few people that I've managed to meet afterwards is they were a lot friendlier in subsequent dialogue. That makes sense, because it's very humbling to realize you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, that makes sense. And of course, in a lot of these public things, you're being very, in my opinion, and I always very polite when I do it, I just ask them what they mean by something. Okay, and nearly every time they don't know. Okay, so that's a very, very powerful question. So that's the bonus tip. And then for those of you that didn't know this trick, the top row is the first slide I showed you, and the bottom row is the second slide I showed you. I changed all the cards. Okay, so whichever card you chose was not going to be in the second lot, and all I did was flip one of them over. That makes sense? That's how I mysteriously guessed which card was missing from the second one. So the magic trick is how so often they do, is that you're not aware of what's going on outside your awareness. That makes sense? And that's the thing with the magic tricks. When you know how they work, you don't fall for them anymore, do you? So once you know how these influence factors work, a lot of the time, if you're conscious of them, you won't fall for them. Okay, so presentations and course are free. If you have benefited and you can or you'd like to, please feel free to do so. And all videos are going on the website. We're going to have a lot of new content because we're reworking the whole course itself.